I was lucky enough to find this Elmo live animatronic in the op shop the other week. I could tell that he was a little animatronic straight away, so of course I had to buy him for just $2. As you can see here, he has a ton of movement, sort of all over, but mostly in like his arms, head, and leg. I'm gonna try and track down more of this specific Elmo later, but with this one, I'm gonna try and make Rocket from the Walten Files, as you can see here. At the very least, I also need to make a plush trap from Five Nights at Freddy's. So now that we know what we're making, we're gonna jump right into it and cut out his eyes. And we do that just by using a Dremel. And we're trying to damage the eyes as little as possible, just in case I decide to make it into a necklace or something later. Who knows, but they're perfectly good eyes, so let's not waste them. I think they're very cute. So this Elmo has 4 buttons on him. The button in his nose is how you do little interactive got your nose sort of games. And the other 3 buttons in his foot, tummy, and upper back just seem to change his mode or move him along to the next subject. Now, Rocket's head shape is very different to Elmo's, and we're going to do most of the changes to the head shape later on when we're working with fabric. But it's going to be much easier for us to do if we can give him those little bunny cheeks first. So we do that by cutting out little pieces of EVA foam and gluing them all together using contact cement. Then we just take a Dremel with a sanding head and sand down the shape. So we want them to look really round. Once we're happy with the shape that we've got, we lightly use a heat gun on them just to heat seal them. And then we can stick them straight onto his face using the contact cement. We also repeat this process just to give him a bit of a bridge to his nose. But honestly, due to the shape of Elmo's mouth, in the finished product you can barely tell, but that is completely fine. The 2 previous animatronics that we've modified have been Stanley from Five Nights at Freddy's and the Sewer Pony from Sally Face. Their base animatronics were very slightly different as well, so they also look a little bit off, so that's fine. I still think that they look pretty cool. Now this Elmo is ridiculously loud, so what we're gonna do, we're just gonna take a little piece of craft foam and we're just gonna stick it straight over his speaker using the contact cement. And even with his speaker covered, he's still very loud, but I just wanted him to stop screaming. With our Elmo quietened and his face remodeled, we can move on to sewing him up a new body. The cool thing about reskinning something is that when you skin it in the first place, if you cut along the seams, you can use each of those pieces as a pattern piece for the new skin. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. The white tag you can see there goes on his lower back, and the big semicircle that's been cut out is where the fabric for his leg is going to go later. This Elmo has a seam down the center front and center back of his body. So this piece that you're looking at here is actually one half of the front and one half of the back of his body. So we need to cut out 2 of them, and that's the whole body piece. And we're cutting it out just a little bit bigger than our pattern piece for some seam allowance. And when those pieces are cut out, we machine sew up the center front seam, leaving the center back seam open. Next, it's time to cut out the arms. Now, Rocket's arms are segmented and he has individual fingers, so there are a lot more little pieces than there normally would be. So we machine sew up each of the little grey pieces to make a tube, and then hand sew on a strip of black fabric to each piece. We use a back stitch to reinforce the seam. And we do that until he's got 2 full arms minus his hands. And then we cut out the fabric for the main parts of his hands, using the arm that we've made as a size reference and the picture of Rocket as a shape reference. And then we just machine sew the front and back together, leaving the bottom edge open to attach to the rest of the arm. And then we just hand sew the hand and the arm together. We can then kind of slide the arms on just to see what it's going to look like. We're not going to sew them on just yet, just because we need to do the legs first and the arms are going to get in the way otherwise. So next we're going to make some fingers. Rocket has 4 fingers on each hand, and we use the same little piece just to pattern all of them. Each finger has a front and back, so we're cutting out 16 little pieces. We then machine sew each of those up to create the main part of our 8 fingers. Rocket has the same little black connecting pieces on his fingers as well as his arms. We leave the very end of one side of the finger open just so that it'll be easier to turn later, and hand sew on the little black strips. Next, we turn the fingers right way out and use a ladder stitch to close up that last little bit of the seam. We then stuff each finger using polyfill, and we use a skewer just to make sure it gets right down to the end. Now we can pin all of the fingers into place and start hand sewing them on using a ladder stitch. With that all done, our arms are effectively done for now, but we'll come back to sew them on later. Before we can sew on the legs, we have to sew up the back of the body. We purposely made the body pieces a little bit too big, and now we're going to cut off the excess. Normally, I would do a ladder stitch here, but I realized that there was enough space for me to fully access the inside of the seam. So we're doing a regular back stitch instead. And with that done, we can move on to the legs. Now, Rocket's legs are basically just simplified versions of his arms. So using Elmo's leg skin as a pattern, we cut out the top and bottom for each leg and the black strip that goes in the middle. Now we can just sew the top leg piece to the black strip and then the black strip to the bottom piece of the leg. Next, we're just going to use a ladder stitch to sew his leg up at the back and then onto the rest of the body. Now that his legs are on, we can start looking at his paws. Again, we're using the Elmo remnants as a guide. So we cut our pattern in half because his paws are both white and grey, and open up the darts so that we can get the shape of the little toe bits. And then we can machine sew up the darts for our little toe bits before sewing up the grey and white halves of each paw. Then we can slide his paw cover into place and sew up that back seam before sewing the paw and the leg together. And now it's time to paint the bottom of his paws. So both paw bottoms are different here. This is the foot that Elmo keeps planted on the ground, so it has some grip on the bottom. And the other one is perfectly smooth. He has some scuffs on it from moving his leg around. So we sand the bottom of both paws as best as we can, and then put on a few coats of white acrylic paint. When that's dry, we can draw on some little paw pads for him, and then paint those on with black acrylic paint. The one on this foot looks so much worse, but because he doesn't actually lift it up, no one's really gonna see it, so I guess it's fine. With our painting out of the way, it's time to finish up the paws. So we bring the fabric from the outside of the paws onto the inside, and then use the contact cement to glue it in bit by bit. With that done, we can slot the bottom of the paws back in, and then use a screwdriver to reattach them. The legs are now finished, and I think he's looking very cute so far. And now we can finally use a ladder stitch to attach his arms to his body. Rocket has a few more details on his body, and the first one we're going to do is his tummy. To create his little white patch, we just cut out an oval of white fleece. We then just trim down the edges a little bit just to make sure that it's not too messy. Then we just position and pin it in the right spot and hand sew it into place using a running stitch. Next, we're going to make his handsome little bow tie. So I checked the blue and green part of our fabric stash and find this really nice blue fabric to use. A little bow like this is really just a rectangle, and we can figure out what size rectangle we want by just holding up a little bit of paper to his neck. And we just use some iron-on interfacing to make sure that the bow keeps a nice shape. So we cut our rectangle out of the blue fabric. We then fold two of the edges together and do a line of stitching. We then turn our bow so that it's now the right way out, and now we can pin and hand understitch the side seams. I really love hand understitching. It's this really fantastic stitch. It basically means that when you're sewing it, instead of just doing a regular stitch where the needle goes all the way through the front bit being the side that everyone is going to see, you can sew with the needle putting it all the way through the back bit, and when you go to put the needle through the front layer, you only catch a few fibers of the fabric. It's still pretty sturdy and it still keeps everything in place, but because you're not sewing all the way through the fabric, you can't see the stitching from the front, which is really cool and works really well if you don't want to have visible top stitching. It's like my favorite stitch, don't mind me. I should probably also mention that we're ironing this little bow every step of the way because we want it to look really nice and crisp. So now it's time to cut out another smaller rectangle, and that's going to be the center part of his bow. We then sew the two long edges together and turn it inside out to make a tube. Once we've ironed it, we can place it onto the center of the bow, position everything correctly, and then start hand sewing it on. From there, we can just sew it straight onto Rocket's body, and with that, his bow is done. Rocket has a little black button just under his bow tie, and we're going to use a shank button here just for that real, no visible stitches thing that we've got going on. Why not? So a shank button has the buttonhole at the back as opposed to just sort of on the front where you can see it. With his little button and bow tie, I think he's looking very handsome. His body is finished, and now it's time to move on to the head. Now the head is the tricky part because the shapes are way more complex. On top of that, if the tension is a little off or if each piece isn't sized properly, it is going to be glaringly obvious when he opens and closes his mouth. So our first order of business here is to salvage the plastic pieces that are in his mouth. I briefly lost my seam ripper, please excuse the fact that I'm using thread clippers for this. So these plastic pieces actually act as a backing for the black bit to keep it a bit stiffer, and it actually attaches the entire mouth mechanism together with those little pieces of elastic that you can see. Now we're just undoing the red parts here. We're actually going to use the entire inner mouth bit, including the black fabric, in Rocket. This black fabric is very thin and very soft. The black fleece that we've got is much thicker, and I don't want to add too much bulk to his mouth, especially because we're going to have to add in big bunny teeth later. So we unpick the red bits and then we unpick the elastic. Putting the inner mouth aside for now, we have to hugely change his head shape. So the grey parts of his face require 4 different pattern pieces, top and bottom for both front and back. There's a lot of fiddling around with this part, making sure that it's going to be the right shape and that it's going to fit and cover everything. So despite this being the same grey fleece, this is a mock-up that we're just using to get the pattern right. And yes, the stuffing for the inside of his head is Sewer Pony and Stanley main leftovers. So now we can finally start cutting out our actual pieces. So we cut out all of the grey bits, leaving the white for now, and we machine sew up the only seam that we can, the center front seam for the head. Due to the odd shape of his head and his cheeks, the rest of the head actually has to be hand sewn directly onto him. The cheek part is sort of the hardest bit here, but thankfully we can pin straight into the foam, even if it looks a little bit nightmarish in the meantime. So now we just use a ladder stitch to sew up the side seams of his head. It's important to note that for now we're going to have to leave the back seam pinned shut hard, but unsewn, because we're gonna need to be able to open that up in just a little bit. As you can see, this gray bit at the front is cutting into his mouth area, so we're just gonna carefully cut some of that out. And now we can move on to patterning the white part of the mouth. So the white part of the mouth is just 2 pieces, top and bottom. So we just make a little mock-up to test it out, and then we can cut it straight out of our white fleece. Temporarily removing the head from the body, we can now hand sew up the white fleece to the plastic of the inner mouth part. And this is also attaching it to the black inside of the mouth. We're using a back stitch here to make sure that the seam is really strong. Once the top bits were all attached, I tried putting it back on the body, and it did not look good. That hard plastic for the inside of the mouth was slipping and sliding around, and it looked ridiculous. And it was then that I realized that I had just completely forgotten to reattach the elastic. Luckily, this can be fixed with some hand sewing and a little bit of contact cement. So threading the elastic through that little plastic holder is just going to keep everything in place, which is great. Problem solved. And at long last, we can finally sew the top part of the mouth onto the head. With his mouth half finished, we now have to pattern the underside of his mouth and his neck area. He looks so weird with Elmo's lower jaw skin on him here. The neck part is really just the lower part of his face, but it's also his neck. And because this bit isn't changing at all, we can just cut them straight out of their respective fleeces. We can then machine sew those 2 pieces together. At some point, I realized that the easiest way to attach this piece was going to be to hand ladder stitch it, as opposed to what we did for the top bit, so that is exactly what we do. Now, you might have noticed earlier that the side of the mouth bits were a bit wrinkled. And this is where we get to fix that. So we can just tuck the excess fabric away into his mouth and just hand sew it up. And here you can see that the mouth shape isn't like 100% accurate to what it's supposed to look like, but I'm not going for perfect. I'm just trying to make something, so I'm okay with it. And now we get to move on to the ears. Now we want his ears to be big and floppy, but also posable. So the first thing we're going to do is to glue some wire into his head. And because the wire doesn't have a lot of surface area, we glue in some little strips of fleece just to make sure it all stays attached. Next, we can just cut 2 strips in his head and then poke the wire frame for his ears through it. And now we can restuff his head. Now it's really important here that his head is stuffed firmly enough that it holds its own shape. Because the rest of his base is hard plastic, it's going to look really weird if the top of his head is just weirdly floppy. We also need to make sure that it's stuffed evenly and that it's not weirdly lumpy. And at this point, we can start sewing up the rest of his seams, starting with the back of his head. And now that we're not going to have to remove his head skin anymore, we can finally sew up that last side of his head before moving on to his neck and sewing the head onto the body. And honestly, the head was by far the hardest part of this whole project, so I'm very relieved to be done with it. And now we can go on to making his other details, like his ears. The pattern for his ears is super simple. We use the same pattern piece for the grey backs of his ears as we do for the white inside bits, and we're going to cut the grey pieces out much bigger than the actual pattern itself. Now the white pieces get cut out to the actual pattern size. Now we machine sew the sides together, keeping in mind that our grey piece is much bigger than our white piece, so we need to be pretty careful here. But when we turn them inside out, we'll have a little bit of grey showing on the front side, which is exactly the effect that we want without any extra seams. With that done, we can turn our ears right sides out, slide them over the wire frames, and just hand sew them on. And next up, we're going to make our eyes. Now I mostly use a really cheap foam on these animatronics, because for the most part, the foam's going to be covered up by fabric anyway, and there's no need to use anything other than the cheapest stuff available. However, we are going to make Rocket's eyes out of foam, and that means we're going to use the nice stuff. Now this is the Yaya Han branded foam, which was created for making cosplay props, so you know it's going to be good. I definitely should have cut this with a knife, but just this once I've used scissors. Once both of our eyes are cut out, we can sand them down. Now I wanted the eyes to be flat on top, but I also wanted there to be a slight taper down towards the base, just to add a little bit of dimension to his eyes. And we can achieve that effect by sanding a slight angle into them. Once we're happy with the shape, we can heat seal them using a heat gun. Then we can prime them with a few layers of Mod Podge and paint both eyes white. We have to do a few layers of the white to get it nice and opaque, but once that's done, we can paint on his very cartoony pupils. Once we're happy with how they look and everything's dry, we just do another layer of Mod Podge over the whole eye. That'll help protect the paint from chipping, and it'll give it a slight sheen. Now we can move on to his eyelids. So Rocket's eyelids are the same material as his bow, so we're going to use the same material for both of them. So we just want to cut out 2 little rectangles and iron down one edge so that it's tucked underneath. We trim it down a bit, and once we're happy with the placement, we can start gluing it onto the backs of the eyes using a hot glue gun. We glue down the 2 sides first to make sure that the eyelid is going to be at the right angle, and we have to be really careful to avoid any wrinkles when gluing down the rest of it. Thankfully, there's a pretty easy way to avoid any wrinkles or puckering here. So what we're going to do is trim down the top edge a little bit more, and then make a few small cuts heading towards the eye. It's a bit of a tricky process, and the back of the eye looks awful, but the front looks good. Once Rocket's eyes are complete, we can use contact cement to glue them straight onto his face. Now we've put some pins into his face to figure out his eye placement. attachment. It also lets us know exactly where to put the glue. Using this method means that we are way less likely to have any glue peeking out from around his eyes. And once the contact cement on both his eyes and his face are touch dry, we can put them together and glue them on. Our poor little guy still doesn't have a nose, so now we're going to give him one. I did actually mess up the placement of the nose a little bit here. It's a little bit lower than it maybe should be, but at this stage there wasn't too much I could do about it. So we start off by cutting a little hole in his face to slide his nose button through, and then we just cut out a little rounded triangle out of black fleece, and then we just pin it over the button and ladder stitch it straight on. Very easily done. Next up, we're going to do the little bunny mouth split thing, and we're going to paint it straight on just using a black fabric paint. It's really important to do the underside of his lip as well. His teeth are going to get sewn into that part of his mouth, but we don't want to have any weird gaps in the paint where it should be black and it's actually white. And while we've got the fabric paint out, Rocket has very sunken in eyes. So we're just going to go in and do a dark circle all the way around his eyes. It's pretty consistent all the way around, but we're going to add a little bit extra towards the bottom. This is a really convenient part of his design. I really feel like it makes his eyes pop, and I just think it looks loads better. And for this next bit, just to be honest with you guys, I kind of forgot that bunnies have tails. We don't know that Rocket specifically has a tail. We don't ever see whether or not he has one, but I'm going to assume that he does. So we just cut out a big circle of the same white fleece that we've been using, and then we just hand tack around the edges. We just do some pretty big stitches so that when we pull on the thread, it'll all gather up into a little ball. Then we can just stuff it to give it a little bit more shape and tie off the thread. With that done, we can just sew it straight onto the rest of his body. I feel like the tail was well worth the few extra minutes that it took to make. Even if you're barely going to see it, it's very cute. And now that the paint from his mouth is dry, we can move on to making his big teeth. So we start by cutting out 4 pieces of this little shape. So Rocket has top teeth and bottom teeth. And the sort of problem that we ran into here is that Elmo's mouth is meant to be shut. Whereas if you look at most pictures of Rocket, his mouth is a tiny little bit open. You can see a little bit of black in there. So we wanted our Rocket's mouth to be just a little bit open. Thankfully, this Elmo opens his mouth really far, so we've still got a heap of motion there. Anyway, once our pieces are cut out, we can machine sew up the edges, leaving the top one open, and then we can flip it so that it's the right way out. To make it look like 2 teeth instead of just 1, we're just going to run a line of stitching down the center of the teeth. So we need to do this for his top teeth and his bottom teeth. And then we can put just a tiny amount of stuffing in them just to give them some shape. The bottom teeth in particular need to be quite heavily stuffed. And that's going to be because they're going to sit inside of his mouth and basically hold his mouth open when he tries to close it. Just to avoid any interference, we're going to put the top teeth a little bit forward in his mouth. So both top and bottom teeth are going to be visible when he opens his mouth, but they're going to be just far away enough that they're not going to hit each other. With that placement in mind, we can start hand sewing on his teeth. Again, it's just a simple ladder stitch, but we want to go over it a few times just to make sure that it's really stuck in there. Once his top and bottom teeth have been sewn in place, we're finally up to the last part, his whiskers. Now there is one piece of official art out there where he doesn't have any whiskers, but he almost always does, so we're going to give him some. I chose to use pipe cleaners for the whiskers just because I like the texture of them. While our Rocket is mostly fleece, he does have a few other different materials on him, and I sort of wanted to add to that by giving him fun whiskers, even if they look a tiny little bit like spider legs. Now I live in Melbourne, Australia, and we've been in lockdown for the entire time that this project has taken and then some. And because of that, most shops aren't open, so it was actually really hard for me to get these pipe cleaners. It took me 4.5 days to get them, so there was a little bit of a delay in actually finishing him, but I do like them and I hope it was worth the wait. So we figure out the placement using some sewing pins, and once we're happy with that, we can just poke some holes in there using an awl. And then we can just stick the pipe cleaners into the little holes that we've made. No need to glue them, they're staying in just fine. His whiskers are way too long, so we just cut them down with some scissors. And then we can just bend and position them a little bit, and he's done. Before I show you guys the finished Rocket, I just want to tell you about the next 2 projects really quickly. So next up, we're going to be making Fetch from FNAF and Candymare from the My Little Pony story Something Sweet to Bite. Both of the animatronics that we'll be using as a base are much bigger than what we've already worked with, and I am so excited to start making both of them. There's absolutely no pressure at all, but I do have a Ko-fi goal open to help fund these guys. You don't have to donate, it's not a necessity, but buying animatronics to reskin them is pretty expensive, so I am greatly appreciative to anybody who would like to chip in. If you do donate at all, you'll be thanked in a YouTube video like this one and a TikTok, and I will write your name or username on the battery box of both animatronics, or as close to the battery box as I can get. As I am posting this video, we are 63% funded for both animatronics, which is incredible. So a big thank you to everyone that's helped so far. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to show you Rocket now. Enjoy! Here you go, bud.
Thank you. lot.